And welcome everyone to Brain Swap. As you can see, we're back in the secret Otaku no Video cave for today, where I am unfortunately I am alone, rather. Evan is out sick today. So apologies for him not being here, but that is just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. So we're here to talk about editing of anime for domestic, like American publication. So when anime is shown on American television and broadly internationally, but I'm only familiar with American television, that's the only edits I've seen. And so we're going to talk about how anime is changed around a bit when it's shown in other places. And we're going to start actually by kind of going a little bit back from the topic and talk about why those edits take place. One of the things that folks often aren't aware of is that, or don't think about as much, is that anime is typically aired at night in Japan. Sometimes it's aired during the day, but it's usually aired like past midnight in Japan. Much of it is aired on satellite television stations, not even regular broadcast TV. So there's a lot of anime there's a lot of anime content that's aired that way, and you can show a lot more at 2 a.m. than you can at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's the thing. When it's brought over for American broadcast, or again, broadcast in other countries, it's often intended for sort of a broader audience. And so they can't show stuff you can get away with at those other time slots when it was originally shown over in Japan. And also there are different broadcast standards in different countries. So there's some things you can show in Japan you can't show over here in America. And there are certain topics that are more taboo in certain places. So then we get into difference in edits and different changes to things over here in other parts of the world. And I want to go through a few examples of this that I think are fairly representative of the range of differences. And a good place to start is with Escaflowne, the Vision of Escaflowne, which got brought over to America. And I mentioned this because I happen to have read an interview with the guy who was responsible for editing that for television. And he wrote in some detail about the decisions that were made and why they were made. And the thing about Escaflowne is a good example of this because the executives saw Escaflowne. They were shown episodes of Escaflowne. The way this happens is that a show gets packaged up and a video is made that kind of advertises the show and says, here's Escaflowne. And that gets shown to various studio execs and network execs. And they show that, and they watch that, and they use that as a basis to decide whether to license a show. And there may be some scenes in there, some episodes, it depends, but they're not going to watch the entire show to decide whether they're going to broadcast it or not, because they just, imagine trying to do that for Naruto, right? There's just too much content. There are too many shows with too many episodes to be able to watch everything before they decide to go. In the chat room, they're talking about the changes to Nausicaa for the edit Warriors of the Wind. I'll talk about that too if I get a chance. So the thing about Escaflowne is that they saw the episode, they saw chunks of Escaflowne, and then it was handed off to a guy to basically make a version for American television, to basically go through there and say, is there anything that we need to switch around? And they discovered that Escaflowne is rather darker and more violent than it was pitched to them, basically. And so the editor went back to the executives and said, I love this show, but this is not quite what it appears to be. And the executives, in their in fairness, they said, well, let's see what we can do. Let's change what we need to make it broadcastable, so we can show it on Saturday morning and not have people, screaming, yell at us that we're showing, gouts of blood or whatever. And let's go do what we can. One of the problems with Escaflowne is that the first episode of Escaflowne has Hitomi, the main character, a high school girl, in a normal Japanese high school doing her normal Japanese high school things. And then at the end of that episode, she's transported to Gaia, this fantasy world, and that's where they spend the rest of the show. And so they said, if we build up this show and then folks tune into the first episode and it's all Japanese high school life, that's really going to throw a lot of people. So they decided, tell you what, let's change around the first episode so that it starts with her on Gaia and then there's a flashback to that first episode, kind of established stuff. And so they changed that and did that in the show. Now, in my opinion, that's one of those changes where it's understandable. Like, that stuff in the first episode is useful and it's important, but it's the kind of stuff that they could edit back into a flashback so you understand the show. And I think legitimately, if Americans had tuned into this cartoon and the first episode was nothing to do with the rest of the show, kind of, I think that would have really been a problem. So they continue to do that, and they removed just like some violence and some stuff that would just not, would not pass broadcast standards. So that happen. And unfortunately, it didn't work in the sense that Escaflowne did not take off in America. Folks just didn't watch the show, and it ended up getting canceled. So it's an example where they tried to make it work. Like, they were like, we bought it, we want to support it as much as we can, but there's just not, it's not going to happen, unfortunately. So that happens. Then contrast that with, say, Cardcaptor Sakura. So around the same time, there was an American dub of Cardcaptor Sakura called Cardcaptors, and that was a little bit trickier because Cardcaptor Sakura has a lot of crushes between various characters. There's lots of characters with who fall in love, although it's like schoolgirl crush kind of stuff. And a lot of the characters are, preteen. In particular, there's this kind of budding romance between Sakura and I'm forgetting the name of the boy. And so for the American version of that, they're like, that's gonna be hard to, like, if we show that on American television, folks are going to get the wrong idea. And there's a lot of, like, Sakura has a crush on this, like, older teenage boy. And so there's a lot of this going back and forth that you can kind of get away with in Japan, but in America, it's just going to look kind of weird. So they toned it down. Like, they established, I believe, that Lee Saran, that her and Saran are, like, fated to be together potentially, and like there's a certain, like, I think Sakura's best friend does a few ooh kind of stuff, but they very much toned down that relationship, and this angered a lot of fans, and kind of understandably. But again, from the executive's perspective, they're like, I don't think we can get away with this on American television. Just American audiences don't. They don't have that. We don't have stories of little kids having crushes on each other in our media. It just doesn't really happen. So that's a different one. And you're right, Liquidus, Robotech is definitely going to be on the list. So those are two good examples of kind of where it didn't really work very well. And Cardcaptors just really didn't find an audience in America, and they showed some episodes, but it just kind of faded away eventually, which unfortunately just really didn't work. Now, again, in the chat room, they're talking about Nausicaa. So this is one of the famous moments in anime history. Nausicaa, the Valley of Wind, was licensed for American release back in the 80s and re-edited into a movie called Warriors of the Wind. I've actually seen it. It is a dramatic rewrite of the story. They dramatically simplify things, they change names, and they just rework a lot of stuff. There's actually one element of that I like, that they simplify in a way that I think makes a little more sense for the story. In that what's in Nausicaa is kind of bigger and more complex, but never really develop it. It's developed in the manga, it just doesn't really happen in the movie. So you get that aspect of the story, but it was dramatically reworked. And when Miyazaki saw that, he was horrified. And he was so horrified that he said, I will never license any of my movies in America again. And this was a problem. I'm assuming Totoro must have been licensed by that point, which is why they were able to release the streamlined dub, the Fox film streamlined dub, which I happen to love, and I think is a great adaptation. And it's another example where I can kind of go in there. But so yeah, so it was such a complete reworking, and I've seen it, and it is if you're going to use the word butchering for an edit and a rework, that's an example. So when Disney got interested in doing Miyazaki stuff, because all their animators are huge, or most of their animators are huge Miyazaki fans, they talked to Ghibli, and particularly, I'm forgetting the name of the guy who basically runs Pixar. He kind of really pushed this, and then Toshio Suzuki, the producer, mailed him a samurai sword with the word "no cuts" written in like a card on that samurai sword. And so when that came, it's like that was their idea. Is it so the license deal was that Ghibli allowed Disney to release their films as long as Disney had no cuts, no edits whatsoever to the movie. It had to run exactly as it was. Now they could still adapt the dialogue for English. A good example of that is in Princess Mononoke, where the priest is drinking some soup and he says, "This soup tastes like water," in Japanese. Now in Japanese, that's a huge insult. It's a slap in the face. Whereas in here, it's pretty mild. So Neil Gaiman, the writer of that, the adapter of that, changed it to this tastes like donkey piss, which works for us. And it's a good example of where, like, you know, an accurate translation doesn't necessarily get across the idiom that you're trying to get across. So Disney's allowed to do that, and they have to send it back to Ghibli and get it approved. But that's the process, and you get everything that's in the frame. You know, every single second of the movie you get in that Disney version. And that's, again, I think why the streamlined version of Totoro went out and wasn't an issue, because it was no cuts. It was the entire movie, and they just, you know, adapted the dialogue. Now, and actually it's another good example of where in Totoro, they changed things like soot sprites, where the original Japanese names just don't have any meaning for us. So they have to find something there. So we're talking about bad edits. Let's talk about some of the more successful edits, like Gundam Wing. When Toonami got the huge success of shows like Dragon Ball Z, or Cartoon Network rather, got the success of Dragon Ball Z on Toonami, they got really hungry for anime, and they started bringing over and licensing more anime and bringing it over here. And they brought over Gundam Wing, and they did something kind of unusual with Gundam Wing. They had one version that showed in the afternoons, and they had what they called the midnight run. So at midnight, they would show the same episode they showed earlier in the day, but this was the uncut version, or it ended up being the less censored version, because there's some things they just could not show on American television. But they basically said, this is the the darker, stronger version, if you will. This is the one with some of the language still in, etc. Some of the blood they could show on the midnight run. And that allowed people to see the two different versions. And that allowed them to see that, okay, there's the, here's the plot, here's the story, and here's something that's kind of safe, if you will, for the average 10-year-old to watch. But then the serious fans, then the older fans could tune in at midnight and watch that and get the full experience, if you will. And that worked exceedingly well. Folks love Gundam Wing for good reason. And it created something of a model, although it hasn't really been followed that much, for how to show anime. To say, okay, there can be a more edited version that is palatable to the average American kid, and a darker version that's available kind of off to the side. And that's kind of a smarter way to do it. The other side of this coin is remembering that there's always the DVD or Blu-ray or streaming release. So one of the kind of reasons people give for doing these on television is they say, look, this is the broadly popular version that folks will see. If they really want to see the edited version, they can go and buy it or watch it streaming and get the unedited version, completely unedited version. It should also be pointed out that the same thing happens in Japan. You know, the version that airs on television is not the same as the version that's on the DVD. The DVD is less censored than the TV version. It's just, not the same kind of edits. There's, the nudity has smoke over it and things like that for the television version. So that's the way that works. Somebody mentioned, so Robotech. Robotech's another great example of kind of extreme edits and localizations. Hey, Kamanoko. So what happened with Robotech is that a Harmony Gold sought out licenses for anime because they wanted a big animated success like back at the time Voltron and G.I. Joe and He-Man and things like that. And so they went to try to license original anime series for American release. And so they brought that over here and they dramatically reworked the... I said that wrong. They didn't really dramatically rework the plot or anything. They came over and they said, we're going to keep the plot, but we're going to add on top of that a sort of meta plot that will reference in the middle of the plot of other shows. And yeah, Liquidus, thank you. I'll talk about censoring kids shows. But with Robotech, they said basically those shows were broadcast friendly enough that all they had to edit out were things like, outright nudity, people getting blown up on screen. There's a shot in Macross of a certain character, and literally just like his head explodes as his ship blows up around him, and it's a very gory sequence. And so that got edited out of the television version of Robotech because again, it just wouldn't fly. And there's a scene in the middle series where a girl is having a bath and she kind of gets up and walks around naked. So it's that kind of stuff they edited out. But then they kind of edited into some of these quieter moments is moments of referencing this larger meta plot about robotechnology and protoculture and all these things. They kind of reworked some of those elements. The protoculture in original Robotech was originally literally an original culture, an earlier proto-culture. And in Robotech, they changed that to an energy source. So that's kind of a significant changing of stuff. But significantly and importantly, it's the same storyline. It's the same plot, right? The same villains appear. They have the same actions, etc., and so forth. They just add into the extra motivations to bring all these stories together. The villains from a later storyline end up being the kind of the master race for some of the villains in the earlier shows. So that adds extra plot to it. But you are getting the plot of Macross and Southern Cross and Genesis Climber Must Peta. You can argue back and forth whether that's good or bad, but it was seen as the most respectful way to get these things on air so people could at least see it. And again, the idea was we are showing Macross to the general American audience. They actually get to see Macross. Okay, we changed the name from Hikaru to Rick Hunter, but does that really matter? What matters is they get to see these shows. So that's kind of where they came from a lot of that. And Robotech is a good example because you really need the folks behind Robotech, particularly Carl Maychek, were huge anime fans. Like they wanted this stuff to be out in American culture. And they were like, whatever we need to do to make this work for Americans, we'll do, as long as, they're seeing the show. It's not, a complete reworking of the plot of the characters, whatever. So you can certainly argue about that, but I think the motivations are understandable. On the other hand, again, there are a lot of times when things get edited around. So Tenchi Muyo is an interesting example of this, where when the original Tenchi Muyo OVA was released on Cartoon Network, there's a whole bathhouse scene in that OVA where characters are walking around naked. And so they changed that by painting bathing suits onto the characters. And they said, basically, look, we couldn't show full-on nudity at 7 p.m. on basic cable. But we could pretend that the girls had bathing suits on. What's interesting is that there's a fan theory around that, because there are quite a few mistakes in that censor, in those changes. Because like there are a few frames where like the bathing suits disappear, and the fan theory is that they deliberately made an incomplete edit to Tenchi Muyo so that the people watching it would know that it was edited. And it would be very clear that there was censoring going on around this, and people would know what's going on. I'm not sure. I don't necessarily, believe that's true. That said, Cartoon Network is known as being one of the more weird and subversive places on television. Their offices. So I wouldn't put it past them, but that's pretty wild, I have to say. So then we get to the kids shows, as Liquidus pointed out. There are a bunch of things here, and this gets to one of those things where understand you have different people working on these things at different times. So often you'll see inconsistent censorship, but it's because person A worked on these episodes or this show, and person B worked on that show, and they have different opinions about what they think they can get away with airing on television, or they have just different solutions to a problem. So Pokemon had the famous episode with the breasts, the growing breasts, and a thing with Misty, which was again just kind of seen as a little too daring for network television, and so that got pulled from airing. And again, you can go back and forth on that, but it's one of those things where imagine what could have happened if that aired and people complained and it became a news story and people started talking about Pokemon and complaining about it. Considering all the stuff that Pokemon had to go through anyway, I think adding more controversy would not have helped the show. They say that there's no such thing as bad publicity. That's not true. There is such a thing as bad publicity. Some shows kind of die. So there's again, there are kind of different approaches to different things. Digimon's a good example. Digimon apparently became an example within the industry for how to adapt an anime series well. Because Digimon basically came in and said, look, it's a kid's show. We want to still include all the stuff from the original show, but we don't need to include all the names exactly the same. We don't need to make all the dialogue exactly the same. If there are long stretches where in the original nobody's talking, we can add a line of dialogue here and there of just the kids kind of chatting back and forth. So there's a lot of stuff added to Digimon to kind of pump it up for the American release, because in the original version, there's a lot of just kind of random walking through the digital world with nobody talking. So they said, that's kind of dull. We can add some stuff and that's okay. Adding interesting material to a show, in my opinion, is always a valid artistic choice, because there are all sorts of decisions and all sorts of things going into a show to begin with. The idea that once it comes out, no other good ideas could possibly be added to that is a little silly. And someone can look at it and say, oh, you could add a line here that'd be a great joke and it would be fun. So and in Digimon, they had to again rework some other things where there was some content that couldn't quite air, but they went as far as they could into the show. Because there's a bath scene in Digimon where in the broadcast version, two girls take a bath together, and in the broadcast version, they talk about doing this, and you see the clothes strewn on the ground, and you hear them in the bath, and then something happens, and they run out, and they've got robes or towels on. So it's a good example of where they couldn't show that on American television, but that was they found a way of getting it across exactly what was going on. watching that, you're like, oh, that's what's happening. It's pretty clear to anyone watching the episode. And I think that's usually the intent behind these things. It's like, we're not trying to pretend these things don't exist. Another good example is in Outlaw Star. So in Outlaw Star, and the name will come to me eventually, but the girl, the sort of android girl, she powers the ship, and when she's powering the ship, she's naked. And in the broadcast version, they paint essentially like a swimsuit on top of her. It's a little outfit, but it's a simple like black outfit on there. And part of the idea there is, look, her being naked does not change the plot. It does not change what she's doing. It does not change her, Melfina, thank you. It does not change her position in the show. It is simply a visual thing. So that's the kind of thing where it's like, okay, we're going to change that so that we can broadcast it. But it's not like a content change in there. Desert Fox asks, censorship only happens on TV, not on streaming sites. There is censorship on streaming sites as well. Remember what I said earlier, that like even in Japan, they don't show on Japanese television the same thing you get in the DVD. And sometimes even the DVD releases have edits to them as well. So on the TV version, if there's a bathhouse episode, there'll be a lot of steam in front of people. On the DVD release, that steam will be gone, or will be much less there. The stream sometimes often gets the TV version. And this is one of the complex things about streaming, is that yes, you're getting the anime, but you may be getting just the TV version of that episode. You're not getting the full DVD version. And that's not because they can't show that stuff. It's because they don't have it. Like that DVD edit doesn't exist yet. So when they license it, when it comes over to them to stream, all they have is the TV version, and nobody's going to go back and throw that in there. And as Liquidus points out, often the DVD version fixes stuff. Haruhi Suzumi is a great example of that, where they went back and they tweaked a lot of things in the animation that were continuity errors and other animation mistakes for the DVD release, because they had time to go back and notice those things and fix those things. So yeah, it's actually a complicated thing. Sometimes you're getting the real version, sometimes you're not. And then also, there's the question of, okay, is that DVD edit the real version? I mean, it depends on how you define the real version. And yeah, Sailor Moon Crystal had a variety of issues. And often, actually, the colors are tweaked for DVD. This is a different thing, is that sometimes a TV broadcast, the color mix is its own thing. And then when they actually go and watch it, they're like, oh, we could totally switch this around. A good example of that actually is Serial Experiments Lane. So that for the Blu-ray release of Lane, they went back and they fixed a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of animation mistakes, and a whole bunch of coloring things in the original where it just showed up really muddy until that. And then they went and they just kind of tweaked the kind of the white balance, if you will. They tweaked the color saturation, and suddenly you could see what was in some of these shots. So yeah, so which was the real version? Was it the one that was actually out there, or was it this fixed version? It depends on how you define it. I would certainly recommend folks watch the Blu-ray version, but then it's like, okay, good luck finding that. So it's hard. And Dragon Ball Z, as Cruz Gonzalez points out in the chat room, DBZ's been through a lot of edits and a lot of different versions over time. And folks actually like, and then you have Dragon Ball Super, where it's like, let's take a different approach, and GT and all that. So it's, it can be really complicated. And Dragon Ball Z is even more tough because it's been around for so long. There are a lot of things that like you couldn't show when Dragon Ball Z first aired, because people didn't know what Dragon Ball Z was and didn't know what anime was. And so it had to be even more censored or edited than it is now. Because just folks are used to that. Somebody in the chat room asked or pointed out there's a difference between censorship and editing. And that is certainly true. My problem is it's really hard to nail down what is censorship, in the sense that in this sort of debate. I mean, technically, censorship means a coordinated society-wide block of something, where a certain thing is not allowed to exist. And that really doesn't happen when it comes to anime and manga. There's no big conspiracy that stops it. So I have a difficult time defining this stuff as censorship. It's just it's an edit for release out there. And yes, we all love Lane. Have you seen the Lane? So yeah, there are lots of different ways it's edited, lots of different reasons for editing, but usually it's really for broadcast standards. And the other complicated thing there is that broadcast standards aren't necessarily definitive. Sometimes you can get away with things, sometimes you can't. Sometimes one channel lets you do things, sometimes other channels let you do other things. It depends on the mood of the nation at the time. Depends on what the censors have been seeing recently. A lot of things in America changed after the Janet Jackson nipple slip in the Super Bowl, and suddenly things got, you could show fewer things than you could before that, but then we've kind of, the pendulum has swung back in the other direction since then. So it's complicated. It's not a hard and fast rule where you can show exactly this much. You can show exactly not that much. It's that kind of a thing. So yeah, so that is an example of some of the edits done to anime and some of the kind of reasons behind some of those. I'm just scrolling at the chat room to see if there was anything I really wanted to point out. So Lakudis points out, so I believe, because the Tenchi OVA episodes weren't, they weren't half hours or anything. I'm trying to believe, I believe they showed all of the OVA episodes, but they like filled it in with other stuff. So if the episode was like, would end up being most of an hour, then they tacked on some other bits from like other stuff into there. Because I recall seeing that on television and seeing all of it. I remember everything ended up there. They may have added more commercials. I think that was what they did. So they showed 50 minutes of it, and then there was like 10 minutes of commercials and some Toonami stuff, something along those lines. And yeah, Pokemon had the thing with the epileptic fit episode, which they cut that out in Japan, so that's understandable. Mm-hmm. The funny thing about Yu-Gi-Oh! And the edits to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that like they toned down that show in Japan, in the sense that like the earlier stuff in the manga of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is incredibly violent, like incredibly violent. And then as they started making the anime, they're like, oh no, we'll make it more kid friendly. It's really, really weird. So Liquidus very early on wanted to get into the audio track and changing the audio track. There's that happens more with the kid shows, where you get different audio for those. I don't know exactly why. Not quite sure where all that comes from in terms of changing the original soundtrack, because it seems like that's a lot of work to throw in there. Now, that's different from changing the opening and ending theme. One of the reasons they do that, by the way, is for time. In Japan, an anime episode, half-hour anime episode, is about 24 minutes. And over here, a half-hour TV show is about 21 minutes. We have more commercials. So they have to edit out something. And so usually what they'll do is they'll make a new opening and ending that are much shorter than the original Japanese version. And that's usually why they do that, just so that they have enough time to show the episode unedited. So that's usually why that happens. And that happens a lot just for that reason. And yeah, 4Kids. I mean, again, 4Kids is one of those things where what more can you say about 4Kids? I'm less horrified at 4Kids dubs because I'm just like, they're taking the show and making it broadcastable for American television, and they may go overboard sometimes, but I can't get worked up into a rage about that. What can you do? I did not talk about Astro Boy, D. What did you want to talk about that? Because there were changes to Astro Boy, a lot of changes to original Astro Boy in the edit, or in the American release, particularly the theme song. So I'll talk about that. The American release of Astro Boy changed the theme song because in the original, thank you, D. Of course, I mentioned that in the header for the video. Duh. So it's a good example of how of some of these changes. Now I remember. So when Astro Boy was done in Japan, it was brought over to, I believe, NBC for his license there and released in America. And the original Astro Boy theme song was instrumental, no lyrics. But at the time in America, every kid's show had a theme song with lyrics. It was just one of the things that was there. And they said, if we air this with no lyrics, it's going to sound weird to the average American kid. So they took the original theme song and just wrote lyrics to it and had a kids choir, sing it. And when that went back to Japan and they heard that, apparently Osamu Tezuka was so tickled by that he had the English lyrics translated into Japanese and sung by Japanese kids, and that became the official Japanese version of the theme song. So they changed the opening theme of Astro Boy based on the American edit, which is really, really weird. But that's a good example of kind of the back and forth, where there was this understanding back then that when you were taking this very Japanese product like Astro Boy and then sending it over to a place like America, much less, Spain or France or Brazil or what have you, there were going to be changes. There were just too many different cultural aspects to try to explain that to an average American kid. So they were much more cool with edits happening for the American version. And especially because there's a lot of wordplay in Tezuka's work and in Astro Boy and such, because of just what the names are. And so they're like, it actually makes sense to give the characters American wordplay instead of just making it Ochonimatsu. It's like we have no idea what the joke is supposed to be about that. So you name it elephant or what have you. So that is, one of those things. Yeah, Sesher points out, they cut out the machine gun. Actually, Astro has a machine gun in his rear end that he uses occasionally. And in fairness, Tezuka said that's one of those things that seemed really cool and hilarious when he first put it in there, and then over time he was just like, that's kind of ridiculous. So he used it less and less as Astro Boy went on, but they definitely changed that out of that. So yeah, that's definitely there. So Liquidus, what changed in the Eden of the East opening? Because I have multiple versions of Eden of the East, and they all use the same song by Oasis. Unless there's some version out there, and there could be a version out there that I'm not aware of that doesn't have the Oasis theme song. I'm curious. We did not mention Samurai Pizza Cats because I haven't seen it, and I'm not familiar. I know all the I know that there were lots of changes from the original release, but I'm just not familiar with all that went on there. So unfortunately, I can't talk to that one. It is another example of a Japanese anime series just completely reworked for the American version. We can also talk about Ghost Stories. So Ghost Stories is an example of an anime series where the Japanese version was watched by no one, and then it was licensed for American release, and there was fan reaction from no one. And then so Liquidus, I'm going to check my Blu-rays because I'm pretty sure, because I've been watching Eden of the East, and I'm pretty sure I'm watching my rips of the Blu-ray, and I'm pretty sure they have the Oasis song on there. Anyway, so I was talking about something else. What was I talking about, guys? Sorry, I completely missed. We were talking about Ghost Stories. Thank you. So they licensed it. Nobody cared about ghost stories. So they basically said, what if we just made up a dub? And we just got voice actors in and they just essentially made it up. So the director went through and he said he kind of skimmed the show and he looked up some of the material. And then he goes and then they just said, let's just get voice actors who just make it a joke dub. So they basically did like an abridged version, an abridged series version of Ghost Stories officially. It's amazing. The original version it's a fun kids horror series, basically. It's, kid Ghostbusters, effectively. And it works on that level. Like I've watched the Japanese version and it's fine. Not the entire thing, but I've watched, bits and pieces, and I think I watched a full episode of the original, and it's fine. The dub is just hilarious all the way through. There's a lot of really fun stuff. I will say there's a fair amount of sexual humor that gets a little creepy after a while. It's like, that's weird, Liquidus. The version I have then must be different. I'll pull it out. That's interesting. I'll be curious to see how they change that around. That doesn't make any sense though, because they would have had to license the Oasis song for that first episode. So why use a different song in the later episodes if you've already paid for the song the first time? That's weird. It's very, very strange. So, I mean, are you sure they didn't do that in the original release? I would say. I just don't know. Again, on Blu-ray in Japan. I don't know. So yeah, so there have been a lot of different changes and edits to shows over time over here in America. So that covers quite a bit of ground here. Again, there's lots of other things. D asks, are the American studios more willing to show suicide and such in shows? I don't think so. I haven't seen a particular desire back and forth. I haven't seen American shows shy away from suicide. And I'm not aware of Japanese studios showing or shying away from suicide. I mean, they had that in Gantz. They had that in other things. So I'm not aware of there being a particular desire one way or the other there. Do they plan to re-release classic Macross? So that's been sort of a big issue back and forth because Harmony Gold still has the license to Macross technically, but people definitely want to release classic Macross, or re-release it, but I don't think like there's a huge push for it right now. It's just one of those things that's out there that some people would like, but I think it would probably be okay, but we have that, like that happened. Macross was released on DVD and you can get it. And if you don't want to see it, there's this thing called the internet, frankly. All right, so that again kind of covers it. Unfortunately, we can't do the after show because that depends on technology that Evan has it set up at his house. So I can't really jack into that particular tool from here, unfortunately. So no after show, I'm afraid. I also want to make a quick announcement here that I'll make another video about later on this week. Unfortunately, we're going to have to put Brain Swap on hold for a little while. I know this is kind of a bit of a shock, but there's been some personal and some health things going on behind the scenes, and I don't want to get into specifics here. But we're having increasing difficulties scheduling Brain Swap and making it work. So rather than have episodes just suddenly start not showing up or us not being able to do it, I think it's better to just put everything on hold until we can get all that worked out and then move forward with Brain Swap or maybe something else. I'd like to start doing some more reviews, frankly. But it's one of those things where you've got to, you got to hold on to that. Or you got to, what am I saying? It's just one of those things where, unfortunately, it's just something that has to happen. It's nothing, there's no like death involved or anything like along those lines. It's just things that are interfering with our ability to schedule and do the show every week. So sorry about that. But again, hopefully we will be back online soon, and we'd rather be upfront about that and let you know. So I'll remove the upcoming episodes from the live events page on YouTube, and we'll once things go, then we'll post a video and we'll go on from there. So we'll I'm confident we'll figure out something eventually, but let's just be upfront and clear to begin with. So FYI. And again, like I said, I'll post a video probably over the weekend just telling folks about that so they're aware. So as always, thank you guys very much for being here this week. Hopefully we'll see you sometime in the very near future, next Sunday AD. And we'll be back with other stuff, with more new stuff. I am keeping up with this season's anime, actually, which is kind of cool. So I might talk about that at some point. So anyway, yeah, thank you all very much. And we really appreciate you all being here. And speaking for Evan and definitely for myself, one of the reasons we're here is because you guys show up every week and we have a good time chatting. And I love seeing you guys talking about stuff in the chat room and going back and forth. So your being here is the reason we're here. So again, thank you all very much for showing up. And again, hopefully we will be back soon. And I hope you guys have a great week and a great rest of the summer. And take care, and we will see you. Bye.